More than 750 million people watched that famous moment on the Buckingham Palace balcony. Charles and Diana kissed as the crowd demanded it, creating one of the most recognizable royal images of the 20th century. But behind that picture was a story that had already begun to unravel. Just days before the wedding, Diana discovered a gold bracelet bearing initials that belonged to someone else. She was only 20 years old. She had almost no independence, no established household of her own, and no realistic way to step away from a wedding the entire country was waiting to see. Yet over the next 16 years, she would transform the very image the royal institution had created around her. The story really began at Althorpe in November 1977. Charles arrived there while Diana was still a teenager. He had originally been interested in her older sister, Sarah Spencer. Diana was only 16, and she was not the person everyone expected the future king to notice. But they met, talked, and Charles later remembered her as cheerful, amusing, and unusually engaging. Sarah, however, quickly destroyed her own chances. She spoke openly to journalists about Charles and famously indicated that she would not marry him simply because he was a prince. Diana watched all of this happen. That lesson would remain important. She learned early that saying too much in public could have consequences inside the royal world. To understand why Diana eventually entered such a complicated marriage, it helps to understand the family she came from. Diana Frances Spencer was born on July 1, 1961, at Park House on the Sandringham estate. Her father leased the property from the monarch, and her grandmother, Ruth Lady Fermoy, was closely connected to the Queen Mother. The Spencers were already part of the aristocratic world. They were not outsiders suddenly entering royal society. Diana grew up knowing exactly where the royal family stood in relation to her own. But her childhood was far from simple. Her parents' marriage broke apart when she was young, and the divorce became a bitter custody dispute. Her father ultimately won custody. For Diana, the experience created a lasting understanding of how family loyalty, status, and reputation could collide. Diana was only 8 when the custody battle unfolded. The adults around her were making decisions that would influence her entire childhood. She later described the experience as deeply formative. She was not particularly successful academically and never tried to present herself as an intellectual. Her strengths were different. She was extremely observant. She could sense tension in a room. She noticed how adults behaved when they believed nobody was watching. And she developed a natural ability to make people comfortable. Those qualities would eventually become extraordinarily useful in public life. By the late 1970s, Diana was living in London with friends and working with young children. She had an apartment of her own and was earning her own way. It was modest independence, but it was independence nonetheless. That independence came partly from family money connected to her American ancestry. But once Diana entered royal life, that freedom changed dramatically. Her courtship with Charles developed gradually. There were meetings at country houses, polo events, and social gatherings. Then came an important conversation during the summer of 1980. Charles had recently lost his great-uncle Lord Mountbatten, a hugely influential figure in his life. Diana spoke with Charles about the funeral and about how alone he had appeared. She had found an emotional subject that allowed Charles to lower his guard. That conversation helped change the nature of their relationship. Diana was invited to Balmoral. Soon afterward, the press discovered her, and the newspapers immediately decided that she was the perfect future princess. One photograph from outside the kindergarten where Diana worked became particularly famous. The picture was embarrassing to her. The public, however, loved it. This was Diana's first major lesson in the power of the camera. The photographers could turn an ordinary moment into a national event. And Diana would eventually become better at understanding that machinery than almost anyone around her. Charles, meanwhile, was facing a very different problem. His decision to marry Diana was not simply about romance. Private correspondence later showed how seriously he considered duty, expectations, and the consequences of delaying a decision. His father also encouraged him to resolve the situation. Charles eventually proposed at Windsor Castle in February 1981. Diana accepted. The engagement was announced on February 24th. The couple then appeared together for a television interview. When asked whether they were in love, Diana confidently answered yes. Charles gave a much more cautious response, qualifying what the word love actually meant. The clip became famous because their answers seemed to reveal a difference that would become increasingly important. Charles had a long-standing relationship with Camilla Parker Bowles. Camilla was not some mysterious stranger. She belonged to the same social circle, attended similar events, and had been part of Charles's life for years. During the engagement, Diana even met Camilla socially. To modern eyes, the situation seems extraordinary. The future bride was entering a world in which the boundaries between friendship, romance, duty, and royal expectation were already complicated. Diana moved into the royal environment before the wedding. She was surrounded by palace staff and preparations, but she was still remarkably young. She did not yet have the independent household or experienced advisors that would later become essential. Then came the discovery of the bracelet. Inside a package was a gold bracelet bearing initials associated with Charles and Camilla. Diana was deeply disturbed by what she saw. According to her later recollections, she confronted Charles about it. Whatever exactly was said between them, the important fact is that Diana knew about the connection before the wedding. She reportedly told her sisters that she wanted to cancel everything. But the wedding had already become much larger than the two people involved. The public had invested emotionally in the event. Her face was everywhere. The famous tea towels and souvenirs had already turned her into a national symbol. On July 29, 1981, the wedding took place at St. Paul's Cathedral. It was not an ordinary royal ceremony. Thousands of guests attended. Millions watched around the world. Diana wore the famous David and Elizabeth Emmanuel wedding dress with its enormous train. Even the small imperfections became part of the story. She stumbled over Charles's name at the altar. There were minor mistakes in the vows. The public found them charming. Camilla was also present among the guests. After the ceremony, the newlyweds appeared at Buckingham Palace. The crowd began calling for a kiss. A balcony kiss had not traditionally been part of royal wedding protocol, but the moment was eventually approved. Charles and Diana kissed. The image became iconic, and millions of people believed they were watching the beginning of a fairy tale. 2 months later, Diana wrote to a school friend about the honeymoon. That letter presents a surprisingly cheerful picture. She described beautiful weather, peaceful surroundings, and the excitement of being newly married. She appeared happy with her new life. Years later, however, Diana would describe those same early months very differently. Her later accounts emphasized loneliness, tension, and the realization that Charles's relationship with Camilla had not disappeared. Both versions came from Diana herself, and that is important. People often try to reduce her story to one simple version, but real human beings are rarely that simple. A young woman can genuinely feel happy at one moment and deeply uncertain at another. The early Diana was still trying to understand the world she had entered. The marriage quickly became less like a private relationship and more like an institution. Charles had his established residence and an experienced royal staff. Diana had little control over the structure surrounding her. The royal calendar was already fixed. Christmas involved the royal family. The summer brought Balmoral. There were country pursuits, formal dinners, official engagements, and endless expectations. Diana did not naturally fit into every part of that world. She was young. She preferred people and children to ceremony. She was not especially interested in the traditional country house lifestyle. And there was no simple training program explaining how to become Princess of Wales. She was expected to learn while millions of people watched. The pressure became enormous. Diana was pregnant soon after the wedding. Her emotional struggles became increasingly visible to those around her. Charles later acknowledged that he had been frightened by how difficult those years were and that he did not know how to respond. Their first son, William, was born in June 1982. Harry followed in September 1984. For a time, the children created a powerful bond around the family. But the marriage itself was becoming increasingly distant. Diana later said that the relationship changed significantly after Harry's birth. Whatever happened privately, the public began to notice the difference. And then came the tour that changed everything. In 1983, Charles and Diana traveled to Australia and New Zealand. Diana brought young William with her, breaking with some traditional royal expectations. The crowds were enormous. But something unexpected happened. The crowds were not simply there for the Prince of Wales. They were there for Diana. People waited for her. They reached toward her. They responded emotionally to her presence. Charles sometimes appeared almost secondary at events that were officially centered on him. Diana had not planned to become more popular than her husband, but she discovered that she had a natural connection with ordinary people. She learned how to speak to children. She learned how to make eye contact. She learned what photographers wanted, and each tour made her more confident. This created a serious problem inside the marriage. A royal couple could survive disagreements. They could even survive personal failures. But the situation became much more difficult when one partner became dramatically more popular than the other. Charles had spent his entire life preparing for the role. Diana had suddenly become famous for performing. By 1986, Charles later said his marriage had broken down and he resumed his relationship with Camilla. Diana's supporters disputed parts of that timeline. From her perspective, Camilla had never really disappeared. Whatever the exact sequence, by the middle of the 1980s, two separate emotional worlds existed inside the marriage. Diana also became involved with James Hewitt. The private relationship became another part of the increasingly complicated story. Then, in 1988, tragedy struck during a skiing trip involving Charles's circle. An avalanche killed Charles's friend, Major Hugh Lindsay. Diana was not on the slope. In the aftermath, she focused on helping with practical arrangements and supporting those affected. People close to Charles later credited her with handling the crisis exceptionally well. For a brief period, the couple appeared closer. But the underlying problems did not disappear. The marriage continued to move between moments of cooperation and periods of profound distance. And then technology exposed what had previously remained private. In 1989, private telephone conversations involving both Charles and Diana were secretly recorded. The conversations were intimate and embarrassing. One involved Charles and Camilla. Another involved Diana and James Gilby. Suddenly, the public was hearing private voices instead of carefully prepared royal statements. The scandal showed just how little privacy the couple had left. But the recordings were only the beginning. The deeper story was about to emerge through a book. In 1992, Andrew Morton's Diana, Her True Story appeared. It contained claims about Diana's emotional struggles, her marriage, and Charles's relationship with Camilla. The book appeared to come from inside the royal household, and Buckingham Palace was furious. What made the book especially powerful was the way information had reached Morton. Diana did not sit across from him for a conventional interview. Instead, questions were passed to her through her friend James Colthist. Diana recorded answers, and those responses eventually reached Morton. That arrangement gave her distance from the publication. She could deny direct involvement, and for years she did. The recordings were only publicly confirmed much later. The book changed the public understanding of Diana's marriage. The fairy tale was beginning to look very different. Then another private recording became public. The press obtained the so-called Squidgygate conversation. Diana's voice was suddenly everywhere. The royal family was losing control of the story. By late 1992, the crisis had become impossible to contain. Charles and Diana traveled to South Korea, where photographs showed two people who appeared deeply unhappy together. The newspapers gave them a mocking nickname. Then Windsor Castle suffered a major fire. The Queen later described 1992 as an exceptionally difficult year. In December, Prime Minister John Major announced in Parliament that the Prince and Princess of Wales had separated. At that point, there was still no official plan for divorce. But the marriage was effectively finished as a functioning partnership. Both Charles and Diana were now living separate public and private lives, and the press was following every move. In 1993, the pressure continued. The publication of the so-called Camilla recordings further damaged the royal family's reputation. Diana eventually announced that she was stepping back from much of public life. She blamed the media. But there was another consequence. By reducing her official engagements, she gained greater freedom from the tightly controlled royal schedule. Then, in June 1994, Charles gave Jonathan Dimbleby a major television interview. For the first time, he openly acknowledged that the marriage had broken down and admitted that he had been unfaithful. That same evening, Diana attended a party at the Serpentine Gallery. She wore a short black dress that had been sitting unworn in her wardrobe. Photographers immediately focused on her. The newspapers devoted their front pages to Diana. Once again, she had taken control of the picture. Then came one of the most consequential interviews in modern royal history. In 1995, BBC journalist Martin Bashir found a route into Diana's circle. He used fabricated financial documents to convince her brother, Earl Spencer, that people close to Diana were secretly providing information to the royal household and the press. The documents were false, but they helped Bashir gain access. Diana eventually agreed to an interview for Panorama. It was recorded at Kensington Palace and broadcast in November 1995. Around 23 million people in Britain watched. Diana spoke openly about her marriage. She discussed Charles and Camilla. She discussed her own relationship with James Hewitt. And she questioned whether Charles would be able to adapt successfully to becoming king. Then she delivered one of the most memorable descriptions of her role. She said she wanted to be a queen of people's hearts. The interview changed everything. The marriage could no longer realistically continue. Within weeks, the Queen wrote to both Charles and Diana and indicated that divorce was in the country's best interests. Diana received her letter in December. The royal institution had spent years attempting to manage the crisis quietly. Now it was officially acknowledging that the marriage needed to end. But decades later, the interview itself became controversial. In 2020, Earl Spencer obtained material showing how Bashir had secured the meeting. The BBC commissioned Lord Dyson, a retired senior judge, to investigate. His report was published in May 2021. It concluded that Bashir had acted deceitfully and had commissioned the fake documents himself. The investigation also found serious failures in the BBC's earlier internal inquiry. The BBC apologized and said it would not rebroadcast the interview. There was, however, an important complication. Diana later wrote that Bashir had not shown her the documents, and that he had not told her anything she did not already know. Her brother's position was different. He believed the forged documents had helped establish the trust that allowed Bashir to gain access to Diana. Both points matter. Diana genuinely wanted to tell her story, but the route that brought the journalist to her had been dishonest. The Dyson investigation did not conclude that Diana's testimony itself was false. Instead, it established that the machinery used to obtain the interview had been built partly on deception. That distinction is important. Diana believed she had finally taken control of her own narrative. Yet the journalist who helped make that possible had manipulated the circumstances surrounding the interview. The divorce was finalized on August 28, 1996. Diana received a substantial financial settlement and retained her Kensington Palace apartment. She kept her jewelry. She also retained the title Princess of Wales. But she lost the style Her Royal Highness. That decision has been debated ever since. Some accounts suggest that the Queen was willing to let Diana keep it. Others indicate that there were disagreements within the royal family. Whatever the private discussion, the final arrangement was clear. Diana remained the mother of a future king, but she was no longer formally treated as a member of the royal family in the same way. For the first time since her engagement, she had genuine freedom, and she used it differently from what many expected. Diana reduced the number of organizations she officially supported from more than 100 to only a handful. She focused on causes that had little glamour attached to them: homelessness, hospices, leprosy, children's healthcare, cancer treatment. She had discovered that her greatest strength was not simply attending formal ceremonies. It was making people look at issues they might otherwise ignore. Her photographs could create public attention in ways official speeches often could not. In 1997, she traveled to Angola to support the campaign against landmines. She walked through a partially cleared minefield while cameras recorded the visit. Some politicians criticized her approach. She continued anyway. Later that year, she visited Bosnia and kept the issue of landmines in the international spotlight. Diana understood something the royal institution had taken years to recognize. The photograph itself could become a political tool. She did not need a government position. She needed the world's attention. Then, in June 1997, another remarkable event took place. Diana sold 79 of her dresses at a charity auction in New York. The idea had reportedly come from William. The clothes raised millions for AIDS and cancer-related causes. Among them were some of her most famous outfits. But the auction meant more than simply selling expensive dresses. Those clothes had represented the public role assigned to Diana. They had been photographed, analyzed, copied, and used to construct her image. Now she was turning that image into money for causes she cared about. It was one of the clearest examples of Diana taking something created by the institution and making it serve her own purpose. Only weeks later, everything changed. Diana died in Paris in the early hours of August 31, 1997, following a car crash. The investigation that followed produced years of speculation. But the British inquest ultimately concluded that the crash resulted from the driver's speed and intoxication, together with the actions of pursuing vehicles. The 6 days that followed became one of the most extraordinary periods in modern British history. The royal family remained at Balmoral. Public anger grew. The newspapers that had spent years pursuing Diana now demanded a visible response from the monarchy. Eventually, the Queen returned to London and addressed the nation. The Union flag was lowered at Buckingham Palace. The public response was enormous. At Diana's funeral in Westminster Abbey, her brother Earl Spencer delivered a speech that became nearly as controversial as it was emotional. Standing before Diana's sons, her former husband, and members of the royal family, he emphasized that Diana's influence did not depend on a royal title. He promised that her children would not be completely consumed by the traditions and pressures that had shaped their mother's life. The public response was extraordinary. Applause could be heard outside and inside the abbey. The funeral became more than a farewell. It became a public judgment on the relationship between Diana, the monarchy, and the media. Diana was buried at Althorpe, the Spencer family estate. Her grave was placed on an island in a private lake. That decision ensured that her resting place would remain under family control rather than becoming an official royal shrine. But Diana's story did not end with her funeral. The battle over her private possessions and personal history continued. Her former butler Paul Burrell faced a theft case that eventually collapsed. He later published memoirs and sold stories and personal material to the press. Other private recordings also resurfaced. Diana's voice, letters, photographs, and personal belongings continued appearing long after her death. Some were auctioned decades later. Her handwritten letters became valuable historical objects. It created a strange irony. Diana had spent years trying to control her own story. Yet, after her death, almost everyone wanted a piece of it. The public wanted memories. The media wanted revelations. Collectors wanted artifacts. And biographers wanted new evidence. Meanwhile, Charles's life followed a very different path. Mark Boland became an important figure in reshaping the public image of Camilla. The process was gradual. There was no sudden transformation. Instead, the public slowly saw Camilla and Charles together in increasingly ordinary settings. The relationship was normalized over many years. Eventually, Charles and Camilla married in a civil ceremony at Windsor Guildhall in 2005. In 2022, Queen Elizabeth II publicly expressed her wish that Camilla should become queen consort when Charles became king. That happened after Charles's accession. Camilla was crowned alongside Charles in 2023. The woman who had once represented the greatest threat to Diana's marriage had ultimately become queen. So who actually won? Charles became king. He eventually married Camilla. The institution survived one of the greatest crises in its modern history. But Diana gained something the palace could never officially grant her. She became a myth. Her image became so powerful that the royal family spent decades living in relation to it. Her sons developed their own public identities partly through their memories of her. And the Panorama interview became so significant that the BBC later faced a major investigation into the methods used to obtain it. But go back to the beginning. Go back to July 29, 1981. Charles stood in uniform. Diana stood beside him in that enormous Emmanuel wedding dress. The crowd wanted a kiss. The cameras were ready. And the balcony image was created. Diana was only 20. She had already discovered that the relationship surrounding her was more complicated than the public understood. She had already realized that her face had become part of a national industry. There was no realistic return to private life. The image was now bigger than the person. But over the next 16 years, Diana did something remarkable. She took the one thing the institution had given her, visibility, and gradually turned it into her own form of power. She did not ultimately control the title. She did not control the palace. She did not control the institution. But she learned how to control the picture. And that may have been the most valuable asset she ever possessed. The balcony kiss had been created to represent a perfect royal marriage. The reality behind it was already far more complicated. Yet the image worked. Hundreds of millions of people believed in the fairy tale. Diana eventually understood that the picture could be used for something else. Charity, humanitarian causes, public attention, and above all her own voice. The royal family created the image. The world turned it into a legend. And Diana spent the rest of her life turning that legend into something that belonged to her.